The city was alive that night, its skyline lit up with neon signs and headlights weaving across crowded streets. Bars and restaurants spilled laughter and music into the night air, and the hum of voices rose like a constant tide. On the corner of a narrow street stood a bar that wasn't much different from the others, yet carried its own character. A dim-lit place with scratched wooden tables, a jukebox humming faintly in the corner, and a bartender who had seen far too many stories begin and end between his walls. It was the kind of place where people came to drink away a long day, and others came to stir trouble. The smell of spilled beer mixed with cigarette smoke hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. To anyone walking in, it seemed ordinary, almost forgettable. But that night, the ordinary would bend. Inside, the crowd shifted between friendly chatter and rising arguments. The jukebox played a song that almost drowned under the noise of glasses clinking and laughter echoing from the back tables. The door swung open, letting in the cold night air along with two men who drew immediate attention. They looked alike, so alike that heads turned not once, but twice. Tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp eyes that took in the room without lingering too long. Their presence carried a weight, though they walked in calm, quiet, without the swagger some men wore like a mask. They were twins, brothers who had walked side by side their entire lives, carrying a silent rhythm only they understood. They chose a table away from the crowd, slipping into the shadows of the dim light. Nothing about them screamed trouble. They didn't raise their voices, didn't act recklessly or loudly. They blended in like anyone else, but to some eyes, blending in was never enough. It wasn't the clothes they wore or the way they carried themselves that unsettled a few regulars at the bar. It was their skin, the color that made them stand out, whether they wanted it or not. Whispers started, low and bitter, carried between men leaning over their beers. Suspicion had a way of spreading fast in rooms like this, where alcohol fueled confidence and buried good sense. At the far end of the bar sat two officers, off-duty but still wearing their badges like a second skin. Their uniforms may have been traded for jeans and plain shirts, but the weight of authority never left their shoulders. They watched the twins with narrowed eyes, as if the very act of walking into the wrong place at the wrong time was cause for judgment. They didn't know who these men were, didn't know their history, their lives, or the blood that tied them together. What they saw was enough for them to begin imagining threats where there were none. The air shifted, though most in the bar didn't notice. The twins leaned closer to each other, speaking in low tones. Their lives had never been easy, but they had fought to build something different. From the outside, they looked like any other young men enjoying a quiet drink. Beneath that surface, though, their bond carried layers of battles fought together, losses endured, victories earned in silence. They had been underestimated more times than they could count, but they never let it stop them. What neither of them knew, sitting in that smoky room, was how close they were to being pulled into yet another fight. Not one of their choosing, but one forced upon them. For a while, nothing happened. Drinks were poured, arguments rose and died, and laughter cracked through the haze. But tension builds quietly, like storm clouds gathering before a downpour. The officers shifted in their seats, watching every move the brothers made, whispering among themselves as if planning their next step. It was a familiar dance, power sizing up what it didn't understand, authority mistaking quiet confidence for arrogance, difference for danger. The room seemed normal on the surface, but under that calm beat, the slow, steady drum of something waiting to break. The twins didn't notice at first. They had grown used to being watched, judged, and measured against invisible scales. To them, a pair of eyes lingering too long wasn't new. They carried themselves with the patience of men who knew better than to waste energy on every passing slight. But this wasn't just passing. This was a building, and the quiet between them, so natural, so unspoken, was about to be shattered. Outside, the night deepened. Cars rushed past, and the city kept on moving. unaware of the story beginning to twist inside the small bar. Those who had walked in seeking nothing more than a drink or a laugh would remember the night differently by the time it ended. They would remember the silence before voices rose, the uneasy glances, the way something ordinary turned sharp in a matter of seconds. What none of them knew was who the twins really were, what they carried beneath the surface, and how quickly the power in the room would shift once that truth came to light. But for now, the bar remained heavy with smoke and suspicion, the fragile normalcy trembling on the edge of collapse. The kind of collapse that doesn't come with warning signs loud enough for everyone to hear, only whispers, stares, and a building pressure that waits for one wrong move to break it all apart. The hum of the Beatoma grew heavier as the night dragged on, conversations bleeding into each other like a rising tide of noise. The twins sat steady at their table, shoulders squared, voices calm, but they could feel the shift in the air. It was the kind of shift that never came with words but with looks, long, measuring stares, like predators circling prey. The two officers at the bar hadn't taken their eyes off them, and the longer it went on, the more the brothers felt the weight of being singled out. They had been through this dance too many times before. It was never about what they had done. It was about who they were. The bartender noticed it too. He moved quickly between customers, pouring drinks, wiping spills, but his eyes kept darting toward the corner table. He had seen enough in his years behind the counter to know when trouble was brewing. He didn't know the twins personally, but he could read the room, and the room was growing mean. One of the officers finally leaned back in his chair, his arm draped lazily across the backrest, his eyes still locked on the brothers. His partner muttered something under his breath, and the first one smirked. They weren't drunk enough to lose control, but the mix of alcohol and authority was enough to sharpen their arrogance. They saw the twins' quiet confidence as a challenge, as if silence itself was a weapon being turned against them. In their minds, this wasn't just two men having a drink. It was two men stepping into a space they didn't belong. The twins didn't react. They had learned the hard way that reacting gave men like that exactly what they wanted. But silence can be mistaken for defiance, and patience for pride. The officers shifted again, louder this time, their words meant to carry. Look at them, sitting there like they own the place. The jab wasn't subtle. It was a test, bait dangling in the smoke-filled air. The brothers heard it, but kept still. Inside, though, there was a flicker, not of fear, but of weariness, a familiar frustration that had followed them all their lives. They weren't just men in a bar. They were always symbols, always judged before they had the chance to open their mouths. One of them clenched his jaw, fingers tapping lightly against the glass in his hand. His brother caught the movement and gave the smallest shake of his head. Not now. Not yet. The tension spread like wildfire. A group of regulars at a nearby table picked up on the officer's hostility and began whispering, leaning in close. Alcohol gave their whispers teeth, turning them into chuckles, then open comments. Words like out of place and wrong side of town slipped through the air. It wasn't loud, not yet, but it was enough to build the divide wider. The twins had walked into a bar for a quiet drink, and now they were sitting in the middle of a room, quietly turning against them. What no one in that bar knew was who the twins really were. Their lives weren't what anyone assumed at first glance. Behind the calm exterior was a history forged in discipline, long nights of training, and endless hours of studying the darkness of human behavior. They were FBI agents, sworn to serve and protect, to face dangers most people could never imagine. But that truth remained hidden, tucked away under plain clothes and the choice to never lead with authority unless it was needed. To everyone in that room, they were just two black men in a bar that didn't welcome strangers. And yet the officers couldn't stop themselves. One stood up, stretched as though he had been sitting too long, and made his way toward the jukebox. It wasn't about the music. It was about the path he took. The slow, deliberate walk that brought him closer to the twins' table. His partner's eyes followed, a crooked smile playing at the edges of his lips. The officer stopped at the jukebox, pretending to flip through songs, but his words carried back over his shoulder. Funny thing. Some people don't know when they're not wanted. The twins shared a glance, an entire conversation passing in silence. They had been here before, in different towns, different bars, different faces. They knew what was coming, and yet every time it happened, it hit with the same sting. The younger twin finally spoke, his voice low enough that only his brother heard. We finish this drink. We walk out. Nothing more. His brother nodded, but his eyes stayed locked on the officer by the jukebox. That decision should have ended it, but endings rarely come when men with power feel threatened. The officer stepped closer, now standing near their table. He leaned forward slightly, hands on his hips, as though waiting for an excuse. You boys lost? He asked, his tone dripping with false sweetness. The bar grew quiet. Not silent, but quiet enough that ears turned their way. The twins didn't move. They didn't answer. And that silence, calm, steady, was louder than any words they could have spoken. The officer's partner finally pushed himself off his stool and walked over, joining the scene. 2 against 2, though the room itself tilted against the brothers. The second officer gave a laugh, low and sharp. You think you're too good to answer? That it? The bartender finally spoke, trying to cut through the tension. They're just here for a drink. Let it be. But his words barely grazed the surface. Authority didn't like being told to back down, not when an audience was watching. The officers had something to prove, not to the brothers, but to themselves, to the room, to the power they thought they held. The younger twin straightened in his chair, meeting the officer's stare. He didn't raise his voice, didn't show anger. We're not lost. We came here the same as you. To sit, to drink, nothing more. His words were simple, calm, but they didn't land the way he hoped. To the officers, calm was resistance, and resistance needed to be broken. The whispers grew again. Some laughed quietly, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The bar had turned into a stage, and every pair of eyes locked onto the unfolding play. The officers stepped closer, the table between them shrinking the space to almost nothing. Beneath the surface, the twins' patience began to crack. Years of restraint, of being judged first and known second, weighed heavily. They could feel the familiar pull of anger, the quiet voice urging them to push back. But alongside it came discipline, the training that reminded them that escalation never ended well. It was a battle within themselves, between the instinct to defend and the will to endure. Meanwhile, outside forces pressed in like a storm cloud. These weren't just men in a bar. The officers carried their badges like invisible weapons, tools they could wield even when off duty. The brothers carried secrets of their own, truths that would shatter the entire room if spoken aloud. But they stayed quiet, for now. What no one saw was how deep those secrets ran. The twins weren't just FBI agents. They were working a case that threaded through the very city they were sitting in, a case involving corruption, crime rings, and men not unlike the ones circling them now. Their presence in that bar wasn't random. It was part of a larger picture, one no one else in that smoky room could see. But for tonight, all of that remained hidden, locked away beneath the rising tension of a single confrontation. The air thickened with every passing second. The officers weren't backing down, and the brothers weren't breaking. The room seemed to lean forward, waiting for someone to make the first move. Every word, every glance, every shift of weight was another thread pulling tighter, winding toward the inevitable snap. And as the minutes dragged on, it became clear. This wasn't just going to fade into silence. Something was going to give. Something always did. The bar had grown too quiet. What had started as scattered whispers and muffled laughter was now replaced with a silence so sharp it pressed against the walls. The jukebox had gone still, its last song cut short, leaving nothing but the hum of the neon lights outside and the sound of boots shifting against the wooden floor. The officers stood over the twins' table, their bodies casting shadows across the glasses half filled with amber liquid. Everyone in the room could feel it. The breaking point was here. The younger twin's fingers curled tighter around his glass, the cold sweating against his skin, grounding him in a moment that felt ready to spiral out of control. His brother sat straighter now, his dark eyes locked on the men before them, reading their movements like pages in a book. It was a skill he had mastered long before, predicting violence before it erupted, and every signal, every twitch, told him the storm was about to break. One of the officers leaned down, his face close enough that the younger twin could smell the alcohol on his breath. "I asked you a question," he said, his voice sharp, no longer hiding behind false sweetness. His partner grinned, leaning on the table with a hand heavy enough to make the glasses rattle. The brothers didn't flinch, but the tension in their muscles betrayed them. Their hearts raced beneath their calm exteriors, the pulse in their necks quick and heavy. They weren't afraid, not in the way the officers wanted them to be. But they were caught in a cage with no easy exit. To stand up was to challenge, to stay seated was to submit. Either way, the trap was closing. Then came the shove. Suddenly, hard, the officer's palm pressed against the younger twin's shoulder, forcing him back into the chair. The scrape of wood against the floor screeched through the silence, making the whole room jump. A few gasps broke out, the sound cutting like sharp edges in the thick air. The elder twin stood in one motion, his chair toppling behind him. His voice was firm, controlled, but low with warning. "That's enough." But control was gone. The officer's grin widened, his pride swelling with the reaction he had provoked. "Or what?" he spat. His hand hovered near his waistband, the ghost of a weapon never truly gone, even off duty. His partner shifted closer, crowding the brothers, their presence swallowing the space around them. The bartender called out, his voice shaking, "That's enough. Both of you, leave it." But his words barely reached anyone. The bar had turned into a furnace, and no single voice could cool it down. The younger twin stood now too, squaring up beside his brother. Together they faced the officers, their eyes sharp, their breathing steady, their bond unspoken but alive in every mirrored move. They were men trained for moments like this, but not here, not under the eyes of strangers who saw them as nothing more than trouble. And that was the cruelest part. They could end this with a single word, with the truth of who they were. But pride and fear clashed in their throats. The officer made the first real move. His hand shot forward, grabbing the elder twin's arm, twisting it back in a motion meant to humiliate more than harm. But he underestimated the man he held. With reflexes honed from years of training, the twin broke free, shoving the officer back with force that sent him stumbling. Glass shattered, a bottle crashing to the ground, the sound exploding across the room. And then chaos broke. The second officer lunged, his fist swinging, but the younger twin caught it mid-air, twisting hard until the man howled. The bar erupted, shouts, screams, the scramble of chairs as people pushed back from tables. Some pulled out their phones, others ducked away, terrified of what might come next. The elder twin's voice cut through the chaos, strained but loud. "Stop this before it goes too far." But his plea was swallowed by adrenaline and pride. The first officer roared, his hand reaching now too fast, too reckless, pulling at the weapon he shouldn't have brought into this room. The sight of the gun, black, cold, real, froze the air in an instant. For a heartbeat, everything stopped. The younger twin reacted first. Training took over, faster than thought, faster than fear. His hand struck, twisting the officer's wrist, the gun clattering to the ground with a metallic scream. But in the scramble, in the clash of hands and rage, the trigger was pulled once. The crack of the shot rang out, deafening, echoing through the bar like thunder, splitting the world in two. Glass shattered above the bar, raining down in glittering shards. Someone screamed. Another cried out, clutching at the sound still ringing in their ears. The bullet had missed flesh, but it hadn't missed its mark. It had turned the night into war. The officers were no longer playing. The one disarmed clawed for his weapon, desperate, furious, his pride bleeding out faster than reason. The other swung wildly, fists cracking against bone, sending the younger twin reeling back into the table, his ribs screaming with pain. The elder twin struck back, his fist sharp, his movements precise, no longer holding to restraint, but fighting to survive. It was brutal, fast, the kind of fight that left no room for thought. The world narrowed to fists, shouts, the scrape of boots against the floor, the raw sound of men grunting with effort and rage. The crowd watched, some frozen, some shouting for it to stop, others egging it on, too drunk or blind to see the line that had been crossed. And then, another shot. This one is deliberate. The second officer had managed to grab the fallen weapon, his hand steady despite the chaos. The shot tore through the air, slamming into wood, splintering the edge of the table the brothers had been sitting at only seconds before. The force of it sent splinters flying, cutting into skin, leaving thin red lines across the younger twin's face. The elder twin moved without hesitation. He lunged, his body crashing into the officer, the two of them hitting the ground hard. They drooped and clattered away again, sliding under a table, but the damage was already done. The line had been crossed, blood already drawn, and there was no undoing it. The bar was madness now. People screamed, bolting for the door, stumbling over chairs and each other. Phones were out, recording shaky footage, voices yelling about cops, about guns, about murder waiting to happen. The bartender ducked behind the counter, praying the storm would pass without another body hitting the ground. The brothers were breathing hard, their chests heaving, their knuckles split and raw. They hadn't wanted this. They had walked in for a drink, nothing more. But now, here they were, standing over two officers sprawled across the floor, one groaning, the other cursing, the room in shambles, the night forever broken. For a moment the adrenaline surged too strongly for thought. Survival had taken the wheel, instinct guiding every move. But then, reality began to sink in, heavy and suffocating. They looked around at the shattered glass, the overturned chairs, the terrified faces staring back at them. They looked at the phones raised high, capturing every second, ready to be judged by the world before they had a chance to speak their truth. The younger twin's voice cracked, low, and filled with a pain deeper than the cuts across his skin. "We didn't start this." His brother met his eyes, the same truth burning in his own. But truth no longer mattered. The crime had unfolded in full view, and the world would only see what it wanted to see. Two black men fighting cops, violence bleeding across the floor of a bar. The officers lay there, battered, humiliated, their badges invisible, but their authority loud in every breath. One clutched his ribs, groaning. The other reaching for his partner, his face twisted in fury and shame. And in that raw aftermath, silence fell again. Different this time. Heavier. Soak, ed in fear, and the knowledge that nothing could erase what had just happened. The bar was no longer a place of drinks and laughter. It was a crime scene now, every crack in the floor and splatter of blood a reminder of how fast normal could shatter. And as the twins stood there, hearts pounding, the reality sank deep. The night had turned, and there was no turning it back. The bar emptied fast after the last shot rang out. Chairs lay scattered, broken glass crunched under boots, and the air was still thick with the metallic sting of gunpowder. The twins stood frozen in the wreckage, their breaths uneven, hearts still pounding from the fight that should never have happened. Around them, only a few remained. The bartender crouched behind his counter, eyes wide with fear, and two regulars who clung to each other near the door, whispering that they had just witnessed murder. The officers lay on the floor, battered but alive. One clutched his ribs, coughing with every shallow breath, while the other groaned, struggling to sit up, his pride bleeding more than his wounds. Their faces twisted with rage, not just from the blows they had taken, but from the humiliation of being overpowered by the very men they had tried to belittle. For the twins, there was no victory in standing over them, only the sinking weight of what had just happened. The younger brother bent down, pressing his palms against his knees, trying to steady his breath. "We didn't start this," he muttered again, as if repeating it would make it true in the eyes of the world. His brother placed a hand on his shoulder, but his eyes were already scanning the room, calculating. They both knew what came next. The truth of who they were, their badges, their titles, the authority they carried, meant nothing in that moment. No one would see FBI agents. They would only see black men in a fight with cops. Phones had captured everything. By the next morning, shaky videos would spread across the internet, stripped of context, edited down to the worst moments, fists flying, a gun clattering to the ground, the deafening crack of a shot. Headlines would write themselves before any statement could be made. And as much as the twins wanted to speak their truth, they both knew it was too late. The police arrived within minutes, sirens cutting through the night, red and blue lights flashing against the bar's cracked windows. Uniformed officers poured inside, weapons raised, shouting commands that made the already fractured room feel like a battlefield. The twins raised their hands without hesitation, not out of fear, but out of exhaustion. They could have pulled their credentials then, could have ended the storm with a flash of a badge, but pride and anger burned too deep. Why should they have to prove who they were to men who had already decided they didn't belong? They were handcuffed, pushed against the wall, treated like criminals, while the off-duty officers were helped to their feet, voices breaking with exaggerated accounts of what had happened. Words like attacked, threatened, and gun spilled from their mouths, framing the brothers as aggressors before any questions were asked. The bartender tried to speak up, his voice trembling as he told them it wasn't that simple, but he was drowned out by the noise, by the sirens, by the authority that stamped its version of truth onto the night. For the community, the news spread like wildfire. Some saw the videos and shook their heads, saying it was another example of men who should have known better. Others watched the footage and felt rage boil in their veins, seeing only the same story play out again. Black men cornered, provoked, then blamed when they dared to stand their ground. Families whispered about it over breakfast, workplaces buzzed with quiet arguments, and the city itself seemed to split down the middle, very conversation carrying the weight of the night at the bar. For the twins, the fallout was personal before it was public. Sitting in holding cells, separated by cold concrete walls, they wrestled with the same questions circling their minds. Had they done the right thing? Could they have walked away sooner? Should they have revealed their identities? Ended it before it began? Guilt and anger twisted together, eating at them in the silence. They had spent years serving a system they believed in, protecting people who never knew their names. And yet, in one night, that system seemed ready to turn its back on them, without hesitation. Their family felt the shock just as hard. Their mother, who had spent her life teaching her sons to hold their heads high but tread carefully in a world that would judge them twice as harshly, wept when she heard the news. To her, they weren't FBI agents or men caught in a public storm. They were her boys, the ones she had prayed for every night. Friends who knew the brothers as disciplined, loyal, and unshakable struggled to reconcile the headlines with the men they had grown up with. Some stood firm, defending them. Others pulled away, afraid of being caught in the wave of controversy. The media wasted no time painting the story with bold strokes. News anchors replayed the same blurry clip of the fight, their voices heavy with speculation. Commentators argued over who was to blame, each side more interested in winning the argument than uncovering the truth. Every flaw in the twins' past, no matter how small, was dragged out and examined, while the officers' accounts were framed as fact. The narrative was set: two strangers who had walked into a bar and turned violent. But beneath the noise, quieter stories began to emerge. The bartender, shaken but firm, told reporters that the brothers had done nothing to provoke the officers, that they had tried to walk away. A few patrons echoed his words, though their voices were softer, drowned out by the louder, angrier crowd calling for punishment. Supporters of the twins gathered outside police headquarters, holding signs that demanded justice, shouting that the truth had been twisted. Still, for every voice in their defense, there were two calling for their downfall. Inside the twins' minds, the toll was heavier than anyone could see. The elder brother replayed every second of the fight, his training gnawing at him. If he had handled it differently, could he have stopped it before it escalated? The younger brother carried a different weight. The sound of the gunshot, the ringing in his ears, the faces of people diving for cover burned into his memory. He could still see the terror in their eyes, even though no one had been struck. That image haunted him more than the fists, more than the bruises. Days blurred together, each one marked by legal meetings, statements, and the relentless buzz of the media outside. The FBI issued careful words, acknowledging their agents' involvement, but distancing itself from judgment until all facts were clear. But the brothers knew the truth. Their careers, their reputations, their lives would never be the same. Even if cleared, the stain of that night would follow them. And the city, already fractured by issues of race, authority and trust, carried the weight too. For some, the bar became a symbol of arrogance and resistance. For others, it stood as proof of what happens when power goes unchecked, when men with badges mistake prejudice for duty. Lines were drawn, protests rose, and conversations deepened into debates that cut through workplaces, schools and homes. In the quiet of their own thoughts, the brothers wrestled not just with the system, but with themselves. They had always carried the weight of proving who they were in a world that expected them to fail. That night, they had fought not just officers, but every shadow that had followed them since they were children. And in winning that fight, they had lost something much greater: the fragile belief that discipline and truth could always save them. The aftermath wasn't just bruises or legal battles or headlines. It was the heavy silence between two brothers who had always moved in perfect rhythm, now questioning if they had made the right choices at all. It was the weight of their mother's tears, the uncertainty in their friends' voices, the judgment of strangers who would never know the full story. It was the knowledge that one night, one moment, had rewritten everything. The city kept moving. Bars kept pouring drinks. Neon signs kept glowing. Lives carried on. But for the twins, and for those who had been there, the night lingered like smoke, refusing to fade. The aftermath was not just what happened after the fight, it was the way it reshaped everything that came after. The trial that followed did not feel like a court proceeding. It felt like a public reckoning. Every moment of that night was pulled apart, replayed, and magnified under the harsh lights of the law and the press. The officers who had cornered Marcus and Elijah walked into the courtroom as men in uniform, but quickly found themselves stripped of the authority that once gave them protection. Their words, excuses about confusion, adrenaline and misjudgment, rang hollow when placed beside the evidence. The surveillance footage, the eyewitnesses, the calm but chilling testimonies from the twins themselves left no room for doubt. The court saw through the story of fear and misunderstanding. It saw intimidation, and it saw prejudice. It saw abuse of power that could no longer be ignored. For Marcus and Elijah, testifying was more than just a legal duty. It was a personal confrontation with everything they had endured. They were forced to relive the night frame by frame, to describe the taste of stale air in their throats, the sound of boots scraping the floor, the fear of knowing they might not survive. But they did it. They sat straight, spoke clearly, and in doing so reclaimed the ground that had been stripped from them in that bar. They were no longer shadows under threat. They were federal agents, black men who carried the truth with a steadiness that not even the system could silence. The verdict came after weeks of testimony and countless hours of deliberation. The officers were found guilty on charges that went beyond simple misconduct. They faced prison time, stripped of badges, stripped of titles, stripped of the shield they thought would protect them. For some, justice felt heavy and long overdue. For others, it was a shock, a crack in the illusion that authority was untouchable. The punishment did not erase what happened, but it signaled something larger, that even those meant to uphold the law were not above it. Yet justice in a courtroom does not erase the wounds left behind. Marcus found himself replaying the moment over and over, wondering if things could have gone differently, if he should have handled the confrontation with more restraint, if speaking up too forcefully had nearly cost them their lives. Elijah, quieter and more reflective, struggled with anger that simmered beneath his calm surface. He had spent years believing that his position as an FBI agent could shield him from the same dangers that haunted black men across America. That illusion had been shattered. He realized that his badge was paper-thin when pressed against Prejudice. The public response was split into two worlds. One celebrated the twins as heroes who had exposed the rot hiding under the surface of authority. They became symbols of resilience, of standing tall when others tried to shrink you down. Another world, bitter and defensive, clung to excuses, accusing them of provoking the officers, of using their positions to push an agenda. It showed just how deeply divided people were when it came to race, power, and justice. But even within that division, one truth stood unshaken. The twins survived, and their story could not be buried. Their careers, however, were forever marked. Inside the FBI, some colleagues respected them more, seeing them as men who had walked through fire and told the truth anyway. Others looked at them differently, not out of respect, but with hesitation, as if their very presence reminded everyone of uncomfortable realities that most would rather ignore. Marcus leaned into the work, determined to prove that this incident would not define him. Elijah, though equally committed, carried a quiet weariness. Both brothers knew their lives had split into two chapters, before that night and after. The wider conversation their case sparked became perhaps the most lasting consequence. Debates over police accountability, racial bias, and the thin line between protection and intimidation resurfaced across the country. Training policies were reviewed. Lawsuits in other cities gained momentum. Communities that had long felt silenced found a sharper voice. Their ordeal, painful as it was, had forced people to look directly at a truth they often tried to turn away from. That power, when unchecked, becomes dangerous. On a personal level, the twins' bond deepened in ways neither could have predicted. They had always shared everything: childhood memories, careers, even the burden of being identical faces in a world quick to label. But after that night, their connection carried a new weight. Marcus often joked to lighten the mood, but Elijah knew his brother woke some nights in a sweat, hands clenched as if he were still pushing back against the wall of that bar. Elijah, in turn, struggled with his silence, wondering if he had done enough to stop it from escalating. They never blamed each other, but the guilt lived inside both of them. And yet, through every doubt and every painful memory, they stood side by side, knowing that survival had bound them tighter than blood already had. Looking back, their story was never just about a bar or a group of officers, or even a courtroom. It was about the fragile balance between power and responsibility, and how quickly it can collapse when fear and prejudice take control. It was about two men who, despite their titles and training, were forced to face the same dehumanization their community had carried for generations. And it was about a society still wrestling with its own contradictions, caught between ideals of justice and the reality of inequality. In the end, Marcus and Elijah did not walk away untouched. They carried scars invisible to most, but sharp enough to change how they saw the world. They lost a measure of faith, but they gained a harder truth. That justice is not something handed down easily. It is fought for, demanded, and often bought with pain. Their lives were irrevocably changed, but they were not broken. The story left behind a haunting question that still lingers. If two men who wore the nation's badge of authority could be treated as nothing more than threats because of the color of their skin, what did that mean for everyone else who did not carry that badge? It is a question that sits heavily, reminding us that justice is not just about verdicts or prison sentences. It is about the deeper reckoning of who we are, what we accept, and what we are willing to change. And as the twins carried on with their lives, each day moving further from that night but never escaping its shadow, their story stood as both a warning and a demand. For honesty, for accountability, and for a world where survival should not have to feel like defiance.